Oke, selamat pagi semuanya. Mudah-mudahan sehat-sehat semua ya. Jadi di sini kita mengawali ya sesi pertama kita, yaitu saya langsung saja ya, sesi pertama kita kali ini adalah tentang Fundamentals of Fermentation in Coffee Processing. Jadi kita mungkin tahu ya, fermentasi itu telah menjadi topik hangat dan menjadi tren di industri kopi dan masyarakat akhir-akhir ini ya. Fermentasi ini sudah bukan hal yang baru. Kita sudah ada ini sebenarnya dalam sejarah kuno dunia ya. Tapi popularitasnya ini melonjak. Kita tahu itu setelah zamannya seorang Sasasestik memperkenalkan yang namanya WOS carbonation macerated coffee. Sehingga beliau memenangkan yang namanya World Barista Champion ya. Beliau memenangkannya di tahun 2015. Beliau ini asalnya dari Canberra. Jadi itu menunjukkan sebuah potensi fermentasi yang sangat besar gitu ya. Dipicu oleh metode ini, maka kita banyak di Indonesia produsen kopi dan roaster, penikmat kopi yang termasuk yang ada di sini sekarang, mencoba mengeksplorasi berbagai teknik fermentasi kopi dalam pengolahan pasca panen. Tujuannya apa? Mereka ingin bereksperimen. How good the flavor is. Seberapa baik atau seberapa enak nanti flavornya itu. Begitu ya. Namun muncul pertanyaan, we have questions. Apakah bahasa yang dipakai atau kita gunakan itu untuk mengartikulasikan metodologi unik ini secara akurat cocok dengan pemahaman kita tentang apa yang sebenarnya mendefinisikan fermentasi. Itu pertanyaannya. Meskipun tergolong baru nih ya, kita memang tahu ya, kita di industri kopi mungkin baru dekade terakhir gitu ya, kira-kira terkait fermentasi. Konsep ini sebenarnya mengalami perubahan peranan di proses pasca panen ya. Dulu dan sekarang mungkin sudah ada perbedaan. Gitu. Memahami dasar-dasar fermentasi dan peran pentingnya dalam industri kopi sangat penting untuk keberlanjutan industri kopi, ya, khususnya sekarang ini mungkin di dalam negeri, bukan hanya dalam negeri tapi mungkin di dunia. Lucia Solis hadir di sini bersama kita pagi ini, ingin berbagi pengetahuan tentang fermentasi ini. Siapakah seorang Lucia Solis itu? Mungkin kita bisa lihat. Seorang Lucia Solis, beliau adalah winemaker. Jadi membuat wine ya. Yang sekarang menjadi seorang spesialis untuk coffee processing. Beliau menerapkan prinsip mikrobiologis pada praktek fermentasinya melalui podcastnya yang terkenal nih, yaitu Making Coffee with Lucia Solis. Lucia membahas banyak miskonsepsi yang sering terjadi di industri kopi dan beliau menyoroti pentingnya aspek ilmiah dalam fermentasi kopi. Beliau bekerja sama secara ekstensif dengan produsen penanam kopi di Kolombia, karena beliau dari Kolombia ya, untuk memanfaatkan inokulasi ragi dalam proses pasca panen yang berkontribusi pada produksi kopi yang dapat direproduksi secara konsisten dan berkualitas tinggi untuk kebutuhan skala besar. Jadi untuk kebutuhan scaling up. Oke, kita tidak berlama-lama lagi. Tepuk tangan untuk Lucia Solis. Please welcome Lucia Solis.
Thank you everybody. Shake it out. I definitely want to thank all of the organizers because putting on an event like this takes a lot of effort to make it look easy and to make it look smooth, and it's definitely not. And so I've been here for 3 days, so I think my body is still a little bit in America, and so I'm trying to catch up. So again, thank you for coming. and listening to me talk about my favorite topic, which is fermentation. The topic is the fundamentals of fermentation. And one thing that I want to convey is that fundamentals means the basics. And one of the things that a lot of people want to know when you're starting fermentation is, how do I do fermentation? How do I start fermentation, the action? The biggest questions I get are, how long should I ferment? When should I finish my fermentation? What microbes should I use? Should I use bacteria? Should I use yeast? And I'm not here to tell you how to do fermentation. That's what the camp is for. So the Fermentation Training Camp, it's going to take us a long time to figure out how to do the fermentation. But what I want to share with you today is the fundamentals of how we think about fermentation. Because before we can do the action, before we can get our hands dirty and start playing with coffee, I want to give you guys some context. I want to give you some way to think about this new kind of creative opportunity with coffee flavors, because as we've heard, there's so much creativity in coffee. There's so many things that we can do with our fermentation that sometimes you feel a little bit lost. A lot of the producers that I work with, they don't know where to start. Should I start with an anaerobic? Do I start with a carbonic? Do I do it in cherry? Do I do it in my pulped coffee? There's so many questions, and it's exciting, but it can be overwhelming. And I know a lot of producers who are afraid to start experimenting because they don't know where to start. So what I want to share with you is a way to think about fermentation so that you can plan your path, that you can plan kind of your fermentation journey. So next. So this is one of my favorite quotes, because in my experience of fermentation, we're all talking about the same things, but we have not agreed what we are talking about. So one of the things that I notice is that fermentation means different things to different people. Depending on who you ask, you're going to get a different response. And that's okay. Language evolves. It's okay to have a different definition. I just want you to be aware that when you use fermentation, it may not be the same as what somebody else is saying. So what I want everybody to kind of get is that I want us to slow down a little bit. I think we're very excited, we're going forward, there's so many processes, but if we don't have a strong foundation, then you can get kind of lost and you get a little bit confused. So what I want us to do in this hour together is to slow down a little bit, and I'm going to be going over some very basic things, and some of you, I'm very impressed with the quality of producers that are here, with the quality of researchers. There's a lot of information here. So some of the stuff that I'm going over can seem really basic and really simple. But I want you to kind of put on your beginner's hat and think about, is there another way to, not just think about, I already know this already, but to say, what else can I learn from this? And how do other people see this process? How do other people see fermentation? Next. So I want to explain how I see fermentation. So I said everybody kind of has their own idea. So my experience of this word comes from my winemaking background. So these are two of my previous employers. And I like to show these pictures to coffee producers because the first one, Opus 1, this is a vineyard. So you can see how even and manicured the grapevines look. Nothing like a coffee farm, unless it's a coffee farm in Brazil. But usually, Brazilian producers are okay, I know what that looks like. But most other places, most other countries that grow coffee, it doesn't look like this. It's not in neat rows. It's not all the same height. It's not so even. So this is very foreign. And the other thing that I really like to show is for Cliff Lady, look at this facility. Wineries are beautiful places where there's a lot of effort into cleanliness and hygiene, where there's a lot of respect for the product. And in my experience with coffee mills in Central America, it's kind of an afterthought. So the space where we process coffee could borrow some things from wine. So if you guys know some of my work with my podcast and the way that I like to share, is I feel like we borrow a lot from wine in coffee that is maybe not very appropriate, but there are some things that we can learn, and that's one of the things that I really love. So when I talk about fermentation in the environment, my lens, the glasses that I wear, fermentation is a thing that elevates the product. It's a thing that provides a lot of flavor. It's a value add. And what I found working in coffee is that that wasn't the first thing that a lot of producers thought of. And one of the things that I found being in Indonesia for 3 days is that the coffee culture here is incredibly advanced in terms of this forward thinking of fermentation. So I'm speaking to you from coffee producers in Brazil, in Colombia, in Guatemala, in El Salvador, big producing countries where they don't want the fermentation. They were thinking that the fermentation was defects, was problems, they really wanted to avoid it. Next one. So this is my experience. This is, working in Napa Valley, taking out grapes from the tank, and the other one is working in a coffee mill. And I like to show this picture because even though it's a different product, grapes or coffee cherries, the concept of processing, the concept of fermentation, the concept of bringing flavor, we can translate that. We can borrow that. So I have been dedicating my life the last 16 years to coffee processing in a lot of different ways, and before that, wine processing. So I really think about how we're going to make this happen, how we're going to translate flavor into the coffee. Next one. So I just wanted to show you this, that not to, brag about all the traveling that I do, but because I get to see coffee in a lot of different contexts. I get to see coffee in a lot of different countries, in a lot of different altitudes, in a lot of different varieties, different cultures. I get to see coffee in so many different contexts. And all of the things, we think we're so unique. We think, oh, that only works in Ethiopia, or that only works in Brazil, or that only works over there. But if we understand the fundamentals, those are things that can translate across a lot of different places. So I just wanted to show this to give you guys context about how I see coffee in all of the different places that I've been able to see it. So next one. And in most of those places, like I said, Indonesia is a huge exception, but in most of those places, the thinking is that we have these processes, like the basic traditional washed, honey, natural, and that the flavor comes from the process. The flavor of a natural comes from the raised beds or from the structure, and the flavor of the washed comes from just being in a tank, and that there's something special about the process. And this is true to a certain extent. Process does provide flavor, but as we're gonna see in this conversation and through this whole day, it's more than just the tank or the material or the raised beds. And the other thing I wanna share with you about this is traditionally, most in Latin America, most producers would think that only the washed, only this process had a fermentation. They didn't really think about honey or natural as having a fermentation. It was only really for this one category because we're used to thinking about this tank. And what I think a lot more people are understanding now is that fermentation is not a step in coffee making. it's something that can happen throughout the process. So it's kind of opening our mind to what fermentation is and what fermentation can do to our coffee. And the other thing I want to share is that these three processes are very well defined. There's, when we say washed or wet or fully washed, these parts of coffee have a definition, and if we want to communicate to other people, if we want to communicate to other parts of the coffee chain, people already have an idea of what these mean. When we see some of the other processes, when we see our carbonic maceration, when we see our hydro honeys, all of these, there's a lot of room for creativity, but I think that's really important that we get to just explore and just try a lot of different methods. And I don't think those have a definition yet. We're still developing that definition. So it's kind of knowing where our fundamentals end and then where the creativity begins. Next one. So when I talk about fermentation, I think about it as a metabolism, and I think about it as energy and electrons. So the reason I want to show this to you, not because we're going to make this about chemistry, not because, I'm going to let the researchers, Dr. Inten's going to do much more of that science. I just want to show you that when we're talking about photosynthesis, we see our oxygen when we see, respiration and fermentation. So photosynthesis is how plants get energy, right? Respiration is how people get energy. And fermentation is how microbes get energy. So I think about fermentation in this energy metabolism, not just kind of a processing step. And the other thing I want to show is that here we see our oxygen is part of this process. Here we see our oxygen. And in fermentation, there's not. So here's a sugar, glucose, here's our energy, and then we spit out some ethanol. So because oxygen is not part of this process, that's why fermentation is always anaerobic. This is why it's a little bit confusing when a producer or somebody who's not scientific is trying to use scientific words and then talk to a scientist, and you think you're speaking the same language. But for a scientist, it's kind of confusing because you're like, yeah, of course, all fermentation is anaerobic because it doesn't have oxygen as an electron acceptor. So it's like saying, wet water or hot fire. It's like that's part of it. Or saying that photosynthesis, like daylight photosynthesis. Well, it's about sunlight. That's part of the definition. Now, you can still use anaerobic fermentation in coffee because the environment changes. So you can do a fermentation like we saw the natural, where it was in air, in the environment, exposed to a lot of oxygen. That is an aerobic environment, but it's still an anaerobic fermentation. So it's one of those things where if we want to be precise, if we want to go further, then thinking more about what we're trying to say. So this isn't to say that you can't use anaerobic, it's just saying, how are we communicating? When I say something, what is the other person hearing? Next one. And these microbes, so this is the point that I was trying to make earlier about processing, and the equipment matters, the tank, the raised beds, how you do it matters, but also the microbes that are in those places matter. So for example, where's my Acetobacter is an obligate aerobe. That microbe needs oxygen, and that's usually what you'll find in your naturals. And so even though it's an anaerobic fermentation, that identity, that microbe needs oxygen for their metabolism, for their activity. So we can't just think about fermentation being aerobic, anaerobic. We also want to know who's there and what do they need. And these microbes, these are just an example of the importance flavor components that these microbes give our food. And I think one of the things that we could maybe adjust in our language is that we're talking about fermentation as a trend, as a new thing, as this like, the leading edge of coffee flavor. And what I would like us to kind of adjust is that, this isn't the leading edge. Well, it is the leading edge, unfortunately, but what it should be is the basics, right? So like all of the other industries that we love with our wines or beers or bread, sourdoughs or yogurts, they're already controlling. They've been controlling their fermentations. They've been controlling their microbes for a long time. So I don't want coffee to be, over here on the leading trend. I want coffee to be at the baseline where everybody else was 50 years ago. I want us to say, we're kind of behind in this way. We have not been paying attention to these microbes that have been there. They're not new. They've been there. They've been doing their work, given us great flavor, and it's now that we're paying attention. So the trend is not fermentation. The trend is that we're like taking off our blindfold and saying, what's going on in here? And I think I like to remind people of that because there's a lot of fear with fermentation that we're adding something new, that we're adding something foreign, that we're doing something external. But these microbes have been part of the story since the beginning, so they're not foreign. What's foreign is our paying attention to them. Next one. So this is the fundamentals thinking that I really want to help convey. And again, I think that we don't have enough words. So fermentation, I think, should be reserved when you're doing something with intention. And the bigger category, the bigger category, the umbrella, is microbial demucilagination. That's what most of coffee has been doing, using microbes to remove the mucilage and wash the coffee and move on. And a lot of people, a lot of coffee producers in the world still use this method. They just want the microbes to clean the coffee and they can dry it. This over here is decomposition. So this happens when you're not paying attention, when you leave something for too long. We know what rotting is like. We know, when fruit goes too far. So fermentation for me, and actually, so people say, so is microbial demucilagination not fermentation? No, they're all fermentation, right? Because fermentation is the action of the microbes. So all of this is technically fermentation. But what I want to do is like separate it out, and because it's about communication. So there's about being correct technically, and there's also about conveying a meaning, about conveying something. So I want to pair the intention with the action. So if you are leaving your coffee to just rot, to just decompose so that you can wash it, there's not a lot of intention, that's just waiting. So that's why I use the word rot. If you just want the mucilage to be removed, again, that's microbial demucilagination versus like a mechanical. But if you want to ferment, this is where the intention comes in. This is where we're going to pay attention. This is where we're going to look at our microbes. This is where we have a direction that we want to go in. So this is just kind of my offering to coffee producers of how we talk about what we're doing and how we interpret what other people are doing. Next. Because there's different ways to use fermentation, right? The traditional mechanical function. For a lot of the world, fermentation still just means removing the mucilage without a lot of extra input, right? If you just leave your coffee, the mucilage will come off. We will get there. But if instead of the mechanical, functional, step of fermentation, you're trying to get flavor, you're thinking about this as a metabolism and a biological process, this is a new camp. And what I noticed in my 10 years working in coffee is that a lot of the times I was over here thinking about flavor and innovation and really crafting a coffee, and a lot of producers were still over here. They were still like, I don't want to over ferment. I don't want to have these problems. I'm trying to reduce the fermentation. And I was trying to enhance and bring up the fermentation. So there was a lot of tension. And I don't think that that's as relevant here, because what I've noticed in Indonesia is that there's so much creativity and there's so much desire. But I do want you to know that that's very unique. It's very unique compared to the other coffee producing countries. They still don't see fermentation this way. They're still thinking of fermentation as just this step to get somewhere else. Next. So for most of the world, coffee producers have been told, so this is a very influential guidebook for coffee producers. So this is from 1963. So since this time, coffee producers have been told, it has been well established that coffee does not improve as processing time increases. So for decades, for generations, coffee producers in Central America have been told, do not ferment longer than the bare minimum. Anything more than that makes coffee worse, it gives you defects, don't do it. So coffee producers are coming from this place of wanting to reduce anything bad. The fermentation was connected with something bad. And then consumers, the other side of the chain said, no, we love fermentation. We want you to ferment more. And you should do that more. And coffee producers are like, what? Wait, less? More? No fermentation? More fermentation? A lot of the people that I talk to are very confused because, you've been told forever, don't ferment more. And now we're seeing, coffees with 500 hours of fermentation winning. And there's a big gap between the historical advice and the coffee that is selling. So I think of my role as helping producers bridge that gap and saying, I know you've been told these things, but there's another way. There's another way that we can look at fermentation. And I think it's also why we need these conversations about fundamentals and about language and about communication, because I think we forget our history. We forget where we came from. We forget that a lot of us don't know this stuff. A lot of us are just kind of figuring it out and kind of walking forward without a lot of information. A lot of producers feel very alone because they're kind of doing it, they're reinventing the wheel by themselves. So I like to kind of remind people that this is very new territory, and having, those expectations kind of set. Next. So I really like this study, I really like this paper because it shows us the microbes that are present in coffee. So I'm gonna explain this real quick. On this side of the axis, we have pH, so from 4 more acidic to less acidic. This is water activity on this axis. This is number of days, so from 0 to 22 days. So this is the source, and I made this drawing. So from 0 to 22 days, scientists were swabbing natural coffee, so that was on a raised bed. And they were seeing how the population changes over time. And it changes a lot over time. Over just, from 0 to 4 or 6 to 12, they had a completely different population of microbes that were there without doing anything. This was just what was in the air and what was on the skin. And what they found over that time is that in the beginning of the fermentation, when the pH is high and the water is high, and this is on cherries, this is coffee cherries, that the fermentation was dominated by bacteria. Bacteria need more moisture, bacteria are more present, and so they are doing the work in the fermentation. But and obviously as they're working, they're lowering they're increasing acidity, so they're lowering the pH. So the bacteria themselves are creating a more acidic environment. And as they do that, as they have more acid, and obviously the water's decreasing because the coffee is drying on the beds, on the raised beds, Then it changes. It opens a window because the bacteria don't have as much resistance. The yeast have they have a thicker cell wall. They're more hardy. They're more tough for these environments. So then later on in the fermentation, it's dominated by yeast because they can handle the lower acid. They can handle less water. They can handle more stress. And so then the flavors are really being contributed through the yeast. So this gives us an idea that when we have a washed coffee, high moisture, lots of liquid, we saw those tanks, that is more of a bacteria-dominated environment, and a lot of those flavors come from that microbe. And when we have a natural, we have more dominated from other population because of the environment. And I like to show this to remind people a couple of things. One is that this was 22 days, very low moisture content. You can see here it's well, you can't see, but trust me, it's 13 to 11%. 11% moisture was still enough to have all of these different microbes available. So a lot of the times, if we don't see it, we don't think anything's happening, but on the microbe scale, a lot of things are happening. And so just because we think we're lowering the moisture content, there's still a whole world active. So this is where I also try to remind my clients in really humid countries that you really want to get low to have that stability because, and yes, this is very slow metabolism. It's not going to change your coffee overnight, but if you have it stored for 6 months, at that moisture content in 6 months or 9 months, there's a lot of activity that can happen. So a little bit is a caution just to be aware that there's still, microbes are very tough and they're very able to continue their metabolisms. And the other thing that this opens up, okay, so yeah, here's wet process is dominated by bacteria. So if we know that bacteria tend to dominate in these environments, and then the yeast dominate in these environments, and our wet washed process tends to give, bright and kind of clean flavors, and then our naturals give us more of a heavy body, more fruity, then we can use this to our advantage, and we don't have to use that process to get those flavors. We can use the microbes. It's kind of like a shortcut. So I can take these yeast that give the natural flavor and put them in a tank, put them in a wash process, and make my washed coffee taste like a natural because I know what gives that flavor. It's not the raised bed and it's not the tank. It's the yeast or the bacteria that are in the tank or on the raised bed. So this opens up a lot of possibilities. And I also have clients that were able to do the opposite. So this was a woman in Hawaii, and for ecological reasons, she didn't want to use a lot of water. But she didn't personally like the flavor of a natural coffee, but she didn't want to use water. So what she ended up doing is kind of manipulating the moisture levels of her cherries. So she did a natural, but she made it taste like a washed. She made it be really high acid and really clean by changing her microbes and not necessarily changing her process. And this is really important because a lot of producers feel stuck. A lot of my producers in Central America, they don't have a lot of space. So they say, I want to make a natural, but I can't build 500 raised beds. They feel like, then I can't do that process. And that's not true. You don't need to have the space to build all of these beds. You don't need to have all of these infrastructure because it's expensive. So if you already have the tanks and we can change our microbes in the tanks, well, then that opens up a lot of flavor possibilities without the investment that can come with a lot of those things. Next. So this is just a paper that I like to share because I think a lot of people still don't believe that microbes can do this. They don't believe that that's powerful. They're invisible. They're tiny. How can they really change our coffee? And a lot of times, especially on the, the consumer side, we'll taste a coffee and we'll say, oh, it tastes like jasmine or roses or apricot. And if you've never tasted that and someone tells you that, you think they're crazy. You think they're making it up. There's no way this coffee tastes like lemons. And what I want to share is that, and a lot of people say, well, is that true? Are people just making it up? Is it marketing? And no, that microbially derived odor-active compounds produced during the removal of fruit mucilage layer, including esters, alcohols, aldehydes, ketones, can be detected in the final product. It is true that you can have these flavor aroma compounds of fruits and other flowers survive the roasting process, actually get into the green coffee. And so it's not making it up. It is very possible to get this. And we know this because we've tasted it. You've tasted a coffee that has this incredible flavor. But a lot of the times, maybe you think, or maybe you didn't know that science has proven this. Science has your back. Yes, these things actually get into the coffee and we can taste them, and it's not marketing. Always. Sometimes it can be marketing. It still happens, but next. So this is also to show you, because it's still really hard to get. You're like, but how? Like a lot of people still say, how does the yeast do this? How do you actually get it in there? And it's really hard to explain in a few minutes if you didn't study biology and you didn't study these things. So it's okay. It's okay that it's complicated, because it is. It's okay that it doesn't make sense, because this stuff is really hard. But what I want you to know with my little cartoon and my little drawing, so this is a yeast. So they're alive, right? Just like we're alive. They're metabolizing. They're doing things. They're trying to get energy. And the way that they do that, so they release these enzymes. So this is a sugar molecule. So we're breaking the sugar molecule. So it's like chewing our food. And they're using that glucose, and they're spitting out or farting out. They're having their waste. And it's just like this magic, right? Like we love the waste of these creatures. It's amazing. So we can get alcohol, we can get carbon dioxide, and then these are all of these like flavor compounds. So they're chewing up these sugar molecules and making these much smaller molecules that we know can get into the coffee seed. I think there still needs to be a lot more research about how these compounds get in and out, but we know that the seed is permeable. We know that caffeine comes out, right? We know we can decaffeinate a coffee. So it's one of those mechanisms, like you kind of have to, if we know things can come out, then things should be able to go in, and we have proven that things do go in, these compounds do go in. So what I want to show you is that, this is another study, that in that Saccharomyces, so this is a little yeast, Saccharomyces, glycerol is highly correlated to acetic acid and ethanol. So when you have a yeast that produces a lot of glycerol, you also can produce a lot of organic acids, acetic acid, and ethanol. Okay, so what is that? Glycerol is a compound that yeast make that gives you like a heavy body. It's a very large compound, and so it can give you that like syrupy mouthfeel weight. So you have this thickness, okay? And acetic acid, well, we know that's like vinegar, but in low dosage, it's sweet, it's fruity. You get some of this like brightness. And then ethanol, where are you? My ethanol, alcohol, you get that boozy component, like that winey or whiskey component. So these things kind of go together when we have a natural coffee that is heavy body, and it's fruity, and it has this boozy kind of character. All of those things are coming from the yeasts that are fermenting there. So this is just another way to show that we can change up our molecules. We can take this yeast and put it in a tank and get that heavy weight, that syrup, that full body coffee. We can get something that is, these characteristics. And so this is just kind of an aside, but I think this is one of the limitations when we label coffee by the process. When we label coffee as a natural or a wash, you're kind of like boxing yourself into a flavor when there's so much more possible. So I think I don't have an answer. I just think that's a conversation to have. How do we want to talk about these coffees? How do we want to label them so that we're not limiting ourselves, but so that you're also communicating the flavors that you want to communicate? Next. This is to show you that all of these microbes are already there. You don't have to add anything. You don't have to bring in anything extra. So this is a study from Brazil. They took 1 gram of pulped coffee, a tiny amount of pulped coffee, and they were able to detect all of these different yeast and bacteria and fungi that were already there. And it's really interesting because this is like a fingerprint. Like each coffee, this is going to be different from coffee in every country, and maybe even from this Brazilian farm next to their neighbor. Each coffee has its own unique combination of all of these microbes that are present. And this is what makes it really hard for producers, because you don't know which one's going to take off. You don't know if your bacteria are going to dominate or your yeast are going to dominate. You can, but it takes a lot of work. So if you're not paying attention, then you can have almost a million different outcomes of your coffee. And this is what I hear a lot from producers. They say, I did the same thing. I harvested my coffee from the same farm. I put it in the same tanks. I did the same number of hours. I did everything the same, and my coffee doesn't taste the same. My coffee is different. I don't know how to make it taste the same. I do everything the same. I see you nodding. You do this. It's very common. And it's because our world is so big, but the microbe world is much smaller. So for us, maybe we think it's the same temperature. We think it's all the same humidity, but maybe it was half a degree different. Maybe it was 22 instead of 23 Celsius, and that opens a window and something else was able to take off. Because for a microbe, a 1 degree difference is huge. For us, we don't even notice it. We think we're doing the same thing. So I'm going to talk about that in a second. But it's just to show you also that all of this is already there, and it's not foreign. We need to think about a little bit how we talk about these things, about these outside influences. Next. So this is showing that the language that I like to use is wild fermentation. Because native, I think, has a lot of emotion when something is native. And also, coffee is not native to most of the places that it grows. So to say, well, the coffee's not native, but the microbes should be native, I think is kind of hypocritical. And I think a better way to talk about it is like a local microbes and a wild fermentation. And I like wild because if you saw the previous slide, there's a million different combinations. So it is wild, all of the options that you can get and all of the things that you can do. So these are the ways that I like to talk about fermentations: a wild, local fermentation or an inoculated, controlled fermentation. Next. So we moved from the washed, honey, and natural kind of basics. And now we have this whole world of carbonic maceration and lactic natural and fermented with yeast, fermented with beer yeast, all of these things. Next, there's a whole list of, next slide, of all of these, just general process that I see, the most common ones. And this is like 1/10 of the list that is possible. There's so many processes that are not included in this. And one of the things that I get asked a lot as somebody who does this work is, can you define them? Can you tell us what this is? And I don't want to, and I don't think I should, because this part of coffee is still new and is still being developed. So I want a lot of producers to keep experimenting. And what anaerobic fermentation means in Colombia and what it means in Indonesia and what it means in Kenya, those should be different. These are different places with different things. I don't know that we need to yet have a Bible of what this means, and if it's not this, it's wrong. We're not there yet. I think eventually we should have that because it helps to communicate, but not yet. I think we're still figuring out, it's still too early to say this is correct and this is wrong, and this is the one way to do carbonic maceration, and everything else is, incorrect. So I just want to share that with you, that we're still developing this language, and I think it's okay to experiment and to just kind of use whatever names. And this is why a lot of the times I encourage producers to make up names. Instead of saying, this is my 48-hour lactic natural, I say, call it galaxy process, call it unicorn, call it something else, because first of all, a lot of times now consumers don't really know what that means, what a natural is supposed to taste like, because we can change the microbes. So I think that there's this opportunity to talk about processing, to use processing to help ourselves in making the coffee, but maybe selling the coffee with that as the label, maybe it's not helping as much as we think. Maybe it's a little bit more confusing. I think there's an opportunity there. Next. Okay, so that was more like my philosophy of things I want to share about how we talk about coffee. What does it mean to think about coffee? But if you're like, okay, Lucia, but what do I do? How do I make this happen? So again, I'm not going to tell anybody ever how to do a fermentation unless I have a lot of information. I think about it as, if someone comes to me and says, what music should I listen to? I can't tell you what music to listen to. I need to know, what do you like? And what are you interested in? It's that personal. That's what I want you to know about fermentation. There's a lot of science and there's a lot of rules. And yes, there is a lot of these fundamentals of things that are true, things that we know that science has proven. But not everything, and there's still a lot of art and a lot of creativity, and it's very, very personal. And so I don't give recipes of how to do a fermentation, but these are the things that I want you to think about when you're going to start your fermentation. And all of these things that producers say, I did everything the same and my coffee's different. And I say, no, you didn't. You didn't because your coffee's different. That's the proof. The proof that you didn't do everything the same is that the coffee doesn't taste the same. So what could it be? What could have been different? So variety. What I've been learning is that a lot of the coffee farms are mixed varieties. There's not a monoculture. I think that's great, but it's just something to keep in mind that as you're fermenting different starting material, you're going to get a different result. The ripeness, how much sugar that cherry has is going to influence your fermentation. The microbes that are on super, super ripe cherry are different than the microbes that are on green cherries. So are you monitoring your ripeness? Can you say I had 14% underripe compared to 17% underripe? A lot of producers aren't looking at that. They're just receiving their cherry, they're sorting out to some level, but they're not looking at that detail, and that's going to change the microbes. That's going to change the millions that are in your starting material. Your temperature, of course. We know temperature influences the speed, like the kinetic rate, and it also influences what microbes like to hang out in the cold and what microbes like it when it's hot. Your water source. Did your water source change? Are you using river water, rain water, city water? That is also going to influence your pH and how much you're submerging, if you're submerging your fermentation. So contact time, are you doing a 12-hour fermentation or a 50-hour fermentation? Your oxygen. Okay, so we talked a little bit about all fermentation is anaerobic because it's a metabolism. But are you doing it, again, submerged underwater? Are you doing it completely exposed? That's going to influence it. Competition. Competition is one that we'll see in a second. What else is there? What else is fighting with your microbes? I did a fermentation a couple months ago, and our water had an algae bloom. So there was a lot of algae in the water, and my algae killed my yeast. And I wasn't able to have my fermentation because it was outcompeted by something else that was there. So again, hygiene. Are you cleaning your tanks? Are you cleaning your pulpers? With what? How often? Because every time you're running your coffee through your pulper or putting it in the same tanks, you're like bathing it. You're inoculating it with some other microbe, some other starting material. Are you adding fruit? If you're adding fruit, you're adding a sugar source, and a lot of times you're adding the microbes of that fruit. If you're adding, pineapple skins or mango or something like that, that's coming in with its own inoculum. And then drying. Oh, we don't have time to go into drying, but drying is my favorite topic. And a really, really common mistake that I see with producers is they put all this energy into making the amazing fermentation, and they have the tanks, and they have the pH meters, and they have the thermometers, and they're doing this fermentation, and then they just dry their coffee like normal. And it's too hot, or it's too fast, it's too strong, and that heat will volatilize. These are delicate flavor compounds. So if we're not drying gentle, if we're not matching our drying to our fermentation, you could lose everything. So a lot of times people say, what's wrong with my fermentation? And I'll say, nothing, your fermentation's great, your drying sucks. We need to fix that. Don't work on your fermentation, let's work on your drying. Next. So these are just some of those pictures showing, kind of mixed quality, green cherry, overripe, this is different food sources for these microbes, right? So just like we have different preferences, some of us prefer meat, some of us like rice versus potatoes, like we have different food that we like to eat, so do these microbes. They have a different food preference. So when you have different levels of ripeness, different varieties, you're gonna get different people showing up to your fermentation party. This is a picture, this one is a mill in Costa Rica. And this water is black because they're an eco mill. So they recycle their water. They're using the same water to process their coffee, and it's very black and it's very charged. So this is a very microbially charged water, and they're inoculating all of their coffee. So that's going to impact the results. And then just cleanliness. When you have these two tanks next to each other, and producers say, I did the same thing, I used my same tanks, I did my same thing, but one went in this one and one went here, you're not gonna get the same results, right? Next. So this is where I mentioned the traditional wild fermentation. This is a visual representation of diversity, microbial diversity. Lots of colors, lots of different sizes, the whole rainbow of different microbes. And that means that over your season, it's, time 0 to 150 days, beginning, the middle, the end, you can have an amazing score. And then you don't know what happened. It didn't turn out great. And then it went better. And then I couldn't get it again. So this is most coffee producers' lives. It's just like, and that's why you have to cup them, and sometimes they turn great, and sometimes they don't. Well, one way to get more consistency, so this is a controlled fermentation. So I'm doing a lactic. So maybe I'm doing, like a salt brine. So now I'm only focusing on lactic bacteria. So now we have only the color blue. But that's still a huge category. That's still a lot of diversity. It's less than your wild, but it's still a lot of diversity. So you can see that you get more even. You're getting more consistent results, but there's still that variation. And what I work with is the last one, yeast inoculated. So this is a clone. This is like if I filled every single seed in here with me. There's just 130 Lucias. So we're gonna get more consistent results than the diversity sitting in the audience. And that's why you can hit this target. You can hit this target every time. This has trade-offs because if you're losing this diversity, maybe you're losing some flavor complexity. There's trade-offs. It's not the answer to everything. But if your problem is consistency, if you just want to hit the same target, you can do that. It's possible. Next. So I'm not going to tell you what temperature to ferment at, or what pH to look for, or how many hours to do it, or what you should use. But if you want to have a successful fermentation, you have to measure and monitor. I don't care what you do, but take notes. Write it down. Write down everything that you don't even think is important. It was a sunny day, and the truck arrived at 2 p.m. Oh, actually it broke down, so we normally start at 5, but it actually didn't start until 7. And all of those things matter, because when you taste your coffee, you're gonna look back and you're gonna say, oh, we had an extra 24 hours that the coffee was in the bags before we were able to process it. That influences the flavor. These things that you think don't matter really matter, and we don't know what they are until we write them down, and then 6 months later, you look back, and then you're like, oh, that's what happened. Because you think you're gonna remember, but you don't. You think you're gonna remember, but it's a lot of information. So take your pH. I'm not gonna tell you what pH you should look for, but you should be looking at it. What is it? How much does it change? Just write that down. Let's look at those things. And, our temperature, touching it. My hand, I love science, I love tools. But the most important tool are our eyes and our hands and tasting it and smelling it. What is this coffee doing? And a lot of people say, is my starter still okay? And I said, did you taste it? What does it taste like? Don't be afraid to taste your fermentations, because that gives you a lot of information. So we have our tools, but our human body is our best tool for knowing. There's a lot of intuition. There's a lot of, I don't know, my yeast seems kind of stressed. So think about those tools that you have available. Next. This is the biggest thing, the biggest tip that I can give you is please clean everything. Clean your pulpers, clean your tanks, clean. And just cleaning, you don't have to do anything else. This will increase the consistency very quickly. You will see this impact very quickly of just cleaning. And I think that's some of the work that we have to do in embracing some of the wine culture is wine spends half of that. If you have an 8-hour day, 4 hours are just cleaning. You clean 2 hours in the beginning of the day, you work for 4, and then you spend the last 2 hours cleaning. It's more cleaning. If you talk to anybody who makes beer or works in food, it's more cleaning than anything else. And in coffee, I really see cleaning being, it's like a nice to have. It's like, oh, we'll do it sometimes. I ask producers, they're like, oh, we clean our pulper once a week. And that's good. Some people tell me, at the end of the year, they clean it. So this is like the most simple thing that everybody has access to, is having that consistency. I think, next. So where does flavor come from, right? Flavor for a lot of these fermented foods, it is from processing. It matters how you make it. It matters what tank it's in. It matters the temperature. The process absolutely matters. But the microbes also really matter, and that's what we're forgetting about. And I think here, when you see, it matters how you treat the grapes to get wine, but it needs to be Saccharomyces cerevisiae, and it needs to be Enococcus that is making that transformation. It's a partnership between the process and the microbes that are in that process. Next. So, in summary, fermentation is a metabolism, not just a processing step. We want to think about it, because then fermentation can happen all along the coffee's life, because most of the producers still were thinking fermentation only happens in the tank. And if it's not in the tank, it's something else. But if fermentation is a metabolism, if it's what the microbes are doing on the coffee, it can happen in the bag on the way to the mill. It can happen while it's sitting there waiting to be processed. It can happen after you've washed it and put it on the bed, as we've seen. Fermentation is still going. Slower, different rate, but it's still going. So we want to think about this whole lifespan of the fermentation. Green coffee precursors affect roast flavor. This is really basic. I think everybody in this room understands that. But a lot of people still don't. A lot of people still think that I can use any green coffee, and if I roast it a certain way, if I roast it light or I roast it dark, I can get whatever flavor that I want. It's very new that we're valuing the raw material. It's very new that we think what we do in this fermentation gets into the coffee and then gets into my cup. That's been the basis of a lot of the commodity market of saying, well, I'll just buy coffee where it's cheapest. If Guatemala is too expensive, I'll go to Honduras. It doesn't matter. But it does matter, and we're starting to pay attention to that now. Coffee is a food. It's so simple, right? It's so basic. You know this. But if I go to coffee mills, it seems like we don't know this. It seems like we don't know that coffee is a food because of the way that we're treating it, because of the way that we're just thinking that coffee is so... Coffee is robust, and it's not going to make you sick, right? We do have a roasting step. You're not going to have anything pathogenic in your coffee, the way if you had a meat plant or a milk plant, you definitely want, we take that seriously. So with coffee, we're very relaxed because of our roasting. So it's not going to hurt you, but you're still developing flavors. It's still affecting the flavor and the consistency of your coffee. So, I really, it's the most simple thing, but I can't say it enough that, when we're looking at coffee, say, when you see these bags or see the tanks or see the condition of the pulper, then you're like, would you lick that pulper? Absolutely not. But you're going to eat that coffee is going to be in your body, so it's not that different to think about these things. And controlled fermentation is consistency. Controlled fermentation is the way that you hit the target every time. It's not the way you make the best coffee. It's not the way you make the most complex coffee. It's not the way you make, you can, but that's not the baseline. So I think also first producers need to get this consistency. You need to know that you can hit the target every time, and once you feel confident hitting that target, then you can go off. And once you have that stable foundation, I like to think about using yeast like training wheels. Like when you're a baby and you're learning how to ride your bicycle, you need the training wheels to help you ride the bicycle. And then once you know how, you don't need them anymore, and you can ride your bicycle as much as you want. But that's how I see the role of yeast in coffee. It's giving you that foundation, that confidence. I know what to do. I know how to do it the same way. I know how to make a promise to my customer and say, I can give you this coffee again. And then you're still free to experiment. It's not one or the other. It's not like I have to make consistent, boring coffee or wild, inconsistent coffee. We can start to bring these two things together. And I think that's all my time. Thank you guys for listening. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Lucia Solis, for a wonderful presentation. Jadi saya mungkin hanya memberikan sedikit rangkuman ya kepada audiens. Sebenarnya summary-nya sudah ada di sini. Jadi bahwa yang disampaikan oleh Lucia Solis tadi adalah fermentasi itu sebenarnya bukan sebuah processing step. Ini saya catatan banyak sekali ini sebenarnya ya. Jadi fermentasi itu lebih dari sekedar processing step atau langkah-langkah untuk pengolahan kopi ya. Tapi dia itu metabolisme. Sehingga di sini sebuah fermentasi itu adalah memiliki peranan penting ya dalam menciptakan rasa kopi. Dan yang terlibat di situ intinya aktornya itu yang banyak adalah yang namanya mikroorganisme atau mikroba. Nah, di dalam fermentasi itu disebutkan tadi bahwa terbentuk prekursor atau senyawa-senyawa cikal bakal untuk flavor dari brew atau kopi yang nanti kita konsumsi. Dan kopi itu adalah makanan. Jadi kopi adalah makanan dan kemudian terkait dengan prosesnya itu harus selalu terkontrol baik itu misalnya kita sebagai mungkin dari prosesor diharapkan untuk mencatat record. Jadi recording ini mungkin tidak hanya pada kopi saja tapi pada semua proses di food industry juga recording itu selalu utama untuk mengetahui kita melakukan apa dan kemudian nanti mungkin ada kesalahan apa yang mau kita perbaiki. Recording, take note and then juga konsistensi dalam hal bukan hanya tadi kita ke noting dan note taking dan lainnya, tapi juga dalam hal kita membersihkan atau higien. Ya. Sehingga itu mungkin salah satu ya atau beberapa kesimpulan yang bisa disampaikan. Mungkin salah satu tambahan lagi adalah bahwa ketika tadi kita bicara soal kata-kata ya atau terminologi lactic fermentation, kemudian carbonic maceration dan lain-lainnya, itu akhirnya intinya adalah it's okay. Jadi dari Lucia tadi it's okay, pakai term apa saja it's okay. Asalkan petani itu nanti bisa menjelaskan dan juga tahu bahwa apa yang dia proses, dan mungkin ketika itu adalah penting untuk selling point dari produknya dia, oke silakan. Ya, jadi tidak apa-apa, tidak masalah karena terminologi itu masih terus berkembang. Jadi Anda mau Bapak Ibu atau audiens mau ke lactic ya, asalkan prosesnya seperti ini, fermentasi seperti itu. Jadi hal tersebut yang bisa disimpulkan ya, dan juga berbagai faktor yang mempengaruhi proses fermentasi juga sudah disebutkan ya, terutama tadi mulai varietas, kemudian kematangan ceri dan lain sebagainya. Jadi dengan memiliki pengalaman yang lebih baik ini diharapkan ya, pengalaman tentang aspek fundamental fermentasi yang didapatkan diantaranya dari Lucia Solis tadi, diharapkan agar produsen bisa berkembang dengan percaya diri, harapannya tidak hanya asal mengikuti tren. Saya rasa sekian dari saya sebagai moderator, terima kasih. Kita akan berlanjut ke sesi berikutnya, sesi kedua yang akan dimoderatori oleh Mbak Yuka Hapsari. Ya.